So let's just read the abstract together and see ways in which we can make this useful for the. So what's interesting about this approach is that it's going to be talking about the long-term contribution of enslaved Africans in the slave trade in large-scale commodity production in Americas to a global economic approach. So interesting that the evolution of the global economy is principal theme. They're not talking in terms of economic growth, which makes it slightly different to essay, but it's interesting to think about the ways in which these two things could overlap. And the useful thing about reading abstracts is that it will tell you and summarize what the essay has done and therefore the central argument. So if you don't have the time to read all of it or the space is to completely summarize the argument within the essay, bearing in mind you only have a 2,000 word word count, you can just use abstract and summarize the argument for an abstract itself. So on which basis the major economies of the Americas, especially the US economy and Western European economies, especially British economy, achieved structural revolution, which included a British Industrial Revolution and its new technology. And as we mentioned from looking at the Vox article, the main tension between the essay that you write is going to be whether it was new technology or the slave trade which contributed to economic development. And in this one, they're saying, it was the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, which came first. And on top of that, economic technological revolution happened. And a combination of these things led to economic growth. So just flagging this here, and just to note that this is going to have 5 sections here. And it's going to have a historiographical overview. So this is one of the first articles you could read and you can use it to form your introduction. And you can also think about conceptual issues as well, which I think is going to be really interesting. Yeah, in terms of methodology as well. The central question of how do we look at a huge socioeconomic formation and just relate it to one key factor. But this is the kind of high level, in-depth thinking that you should try to be adopting in the essay. If you can read it and start to think, oh, maybe I agree with what the author has written in this section, or I don't agree with, his comment about the economy here. That is going to be really useful. Let's return to the PowerPoint and think about another angle that we can be doing. So in recent years in the UK, a lot of historiography and a lot of academic historians have focused on how the current wealth of the UK, both before and after the Industrial Revolution, is linked directly to slavery. So it's almost, drawing like a direct causative link between them and seeing why and how the fact that people owned slaves or partook in the slave trade overseas, how that links to the current wealth of the UK. So this is a fairly short paper on this. And this is really interesting partly for its methodology. So for example, the question of establishing causality is central, as I've mentioned, right? Because how do you link the slave trade to this? How do you link economic growth to the slave trade, which, was a huge process? How do you directly connect a causative link? And one way you could do this is by looking at overseas holdings. And they say to establish causality, we use arguably exogenous variation in slave mortality in the passage from Africa to the Indies, driven by weather shocks. So, yeah, we find that Britain would have been substantially poorer and more agriculture in the absence of overseas slave wealth. So if we're thinking about the art historiography as a spectrum, this falls much more on the side of the spectrum, saying that the slave trade was responsible and directly contributed to the Industrial Revolution.